Hi, and welcome to the Agents for Creative Action staff interview series. My name is Leah. I'm a senior art history major, and I'm going to quickly introduce this series and then we'll jump into our interview for the day with Director Pam Franks of the WICMA. So, one of the continued projects we do as members of the WICMA's ACA, or Agents for Creative Action, is connecting with the museum staff. And we found that in this time of isolation, it would be important to continue this relationship and connection with the WICMA staff. And although prior to social distancing and the coronavirus outbreak, we were able to do this in person at the museum. We felt that doing these interviews might be a nice way to hear more about the museum professionals and what they do in the museum, and also learn a little bit about them outside of the museum. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to my co-host.
All right, thank you, Leah. I am Annie. I am a sophomore currently, majoring in studio art, and I'm here calling from home in Michigan. So thank you, Pam, for being with us. And if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Sure, thank you for having me. It's great to be here. I'm Pam Franks. I'm the class of 1956 director of the Williams College Museum of Art. And I am sitting here in my house on campus, talking to you wherever you are.
Mm-hmm. Great. So we're going to dive into our questions then. So, Pam, you were at Yale for 14 years, which is a long time, before coming to Williams. Coming to Williams about 2 years ago at this point. And so I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit to your experience moving from Yale to Williams, and what were some of the things that drew you to Williams in the first place?
Oh yeah, I'd love to. I was really lucky to work at the Yale University Art Gallery for 14 years, and I worked in a variety of positions. I was an educator, I was a curator, I was a deputy director, so I got a real sense of the overall working of that museum and of museums generally, and especially of museums in college and university settings, and fell in love with academic museums through my work at Yale. One of the things that Yale and Williams have in common, and perhaps are the two very best schools for, is centering the arts in the curriculum. Both Yale and Williams have an incredible sense of how valuable the arts are across disciplines, how important the visual arts are, how important collections are, and engage students directly with the creative arts and collections in such innovative ways across all the every dimension you can imagine. So that was a big part of why Williams was so appealing. The other thing that I knew even before coming here would be pretty incredible is to do this work at a more intimate scale and in an environment where liberal arts is such a clear and exclusive focus. So as compared to the university environment, where there's a lot of opportunities with professional schools and just the bigger situation, at Williams, I was really excited about the possibilities of focusing on the liberal arts specifically and deepening the relationships with the collection and with the students in this smaller environment where the connections are all so much more intimate and can be very even more creative, I think. The other thing, can I say one more thing?
Yeah, of course.
The other thing that was great about my time at Yale was I was there during a time of thinking about the facilities and the buildings and renovating the buildings and thinking about what kind of spaces we wanted to create for the art, but even more importantly, what kind of experiences we wanted to create for the students in the museum through the renovation project. And knowing that Williams is coming up on its centennial, the Williams College Museum of Art is coming up on its centennial, there was this huge possibility at WICMA to think about the next century and the future. And so taking that exciting experience that I had at Yale about thinking toward the future and bringing it to Williams and working with everybody here to think about what WICMA is going to be for future generations, super exciting to me.
Great, thank you so much. So I love what you said about how WICMA is a slightly more intimate setting, and I definitely feel that every time that I walk into WICMA, even just having the art history offices down below, it feels all very liberal arts and very intimate to me. But I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit to maybe how you've seen this play out in your past 2 years here, whether it's in the exhibitions or in the programs, or even just in your relationships with other staff members. I'd love to hear a little bit more about what it is specifically at WICMA that you found to be slightly more intimate, really diving into the liberal arts aspect of the community and the museum.
Sure. Well, one of the first things that I did when I arrived at WICMA was meet with the students of ACA, and we had a great conversation about why the museum is meaningful to all of you and what your hopes are in connecting with the museum, why you love art, how you came to art and museums. And I got a really great sense of how you all as a group come together as a community around art. And everybody's bringing very different intellectual perspectives, very different passions for your different interests, and bringing them to bear on not only the way that you interact with the museum and the collection, but also with each other. So I think that was a very early example of seeing the kind of liveliness and intimacy of what the experience of the liberal arts environment in action. I would also say, some of the programs where you see students responding through poetry to the collection, music to the collection, those have been very vibrant examples. And then, of course, teaching with the collection, which happens across every discipline, and I think every department at Williams has at least one or two faculty members, sometimes many more, who are teaching with the collection. And so this full range of ways of engaging from, within coursework to more creative extracurricular ways. And then I think most importantly, the way that people come together as a community around the museum. That's just been really vibrant and pretty incredible to become part of.
Thank you so much. That was really lovely response and certainly resonated with me. So my next question for you is, given that we're all not in a museum, I'm currently in Maryland, and I know everyone is sort of spread out across the world. I'm wondering if there is a particular work of art in the collection that you feel connected to or have been looking at or thinking about right now in this time of social isolation, and why this particular work of art, or if not a work of art, then a poem. We were talking to Nina yesterday a lot about her artistic practices, and she loves poetry. And so if there's any sort of work of art or artistic creation that you've been looking to as a source of inspiration during this difficult time.
Sure, thank you for that question. You know, in a way, I have been focused a lot on perhaps the most signature work of the Whitman collection, Louise Bourgeois' Eyes. In this moment, when we're all talking to each other on Zoom, I can't tell you how often I have thought about how important eye contact is and how important um, vision is. And that's something that Louise Bourgeois has talked about a lot as an artist, and why the iconography of eyes are so prevalent in her work. You know, she's the gratitude that she felt for vision um, as she made her life as an artist is something that's always resonated with me, and you know, has reminded me how grateful I am for the ability to see, and for all of the meaning and pleasure that seeing visual arts brings to me. So even prior to coming to WICMA and falling further in love with eyes, that was a concept that was really resonant for me. But it's become newly resonant in this funny time when we are sort of seeing each other. You're not really clear if you're supposed to be looking at the camera, or you're supposed to be looking at the other person on the screen's eyes, and how do you connect? And you don't know exactly what they're seeing because we're separated by social distance. And so that's been, you know, on my mind every time I take a walk around Williamstown and check out the sculpture. The other thing that's really resonant for me about that work right now is thinking about the relationship between art and nature, and different kinds of aesthetic experience, and how a lot of the visual pleasure that we're able to partake of now is in nature. And how when people start coming back into the world and are looking for art experiences, maybe some of the first art experiences are going to be art outdoors. So paying attention to how art that's situated, that's placed outdoors in the landscape, how that resonates differently, and trying to make the most of it. So recently we've been working on an outdoor sculpture map with the other museums in the area, with the Clark and Mass MoCA, and have incorporated a biking trail. And I think, you know, it'll be one of the first ways that people engage with art when they come back out into the world. And people are going, I certainly am going to be very eager to reconnect with works of art that I'm very connected to, and you know, and sort of be able to get back into museums. But even before that, I think art outdoors is a really timely possibility for us.
Yeah, that's interesting. I was actually just last night thinking about how my vision of what art is has changed in isolation. I was reading about this concept of categorizing different modes of art by the senses. So the art of the feeling, or the art of the sense of sight, the art of the sense of smell, of touch, and so on. And as you were saying, like, now that we're in isolation and I'm not, the more obvious modes of art aren't as readily available. The art in these senses is becoming more obvious. So I imagine, like, as you were saying, going back and maybe having more of an emphasis on the outside art or nature. That's very exciting. And I think a lot of people coming back to WICMA after this sense of isolation will grasp onto that very readily, and our view of art will hopefully infiltrate and expand the WICMA collection, as well as just how we all approach different museums. And going along with that line of thought, I know you're mentioning just now the incorporation of maybe this trail, or expanding WICMA to, or the art experience at Williams to more integrated with going outside into the Clark and things like that. But is there anything on your mind right now, perhaps a project or some initiative or direction regarding changes that you'd like to see in the museum, either it maybe at WICMA, but also maybe more generally with how museums are run today?
Mm-hmm. One thing I'm really excited about for WICMA and for all museums is the opportunity to show more of the collection, and to think about how we interpret our collections and what kind of research we make available, and how we think about engaging everybody who comes to our museums with that process of rethinking collections. It's such an opportunity, and most museums, WICMA included, can only show a small portion of the collection. So it's important to, rotate galleries and make sure that people know what the holdings are and have a chance to see new works of art. So I'm really excited about that kind of reconsideration of WICMA's collection and thinking about how people engage with it. In particular, I'm interested in how the collection is growing and how that relates to the works that have been part of the collection for many years. So thinking about works that are very sort of signature works for the museum, and then thinking about how more recent acquisitions sort of change how we see the collection. A great example of this is actually from before I was here, and it was when the wonderful Sam Gilliam Drake painting was acquired, and there were 3 different rotations of works from the collection with that painting to highlight a new acquisition, and it 3 entirely different contexts for thinking about that work of art, and it called my attention, and I think was very successful in actually calling a lot of people's attention to how rich a single work of art can be, and how the different frames of interpretation and context can actually change the way you look at a work of art, and do that in an ongoing way so that it is a kind of really dynamic relationship that people can form with specific works of art.
Yeah, I've been thinking about that as well. That's wonderful. The idea of many museums are now just getting rid of permanent collections and only rotating exhibitions. And of course, how art is presented to the public is constantly changing, from salons to permanent collections to more innovative, maybe just art experiences now. And of course, this is always on museums' minds on how to best present art to the public. And I was wondering, do you have an ideal for how art should be displayed, or some ideal way in your mind to display art, or perhaps some museum that's getting it right? Or do you think maybe in a different direction that it's constantly changing and there's no one ideal way that you can stick with, that you're going to be reacting to the community as it comes?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's probably healthy to be open to continuing to refine and evolve the presentation of art. I think that's probably a good way of achieving good results. The principle I always work by is starting from specific works of art, and whatever the object is, making sure it looks as great as it can look. And that could be it's beautiful in the setting. It could be that it's visually enticing in some way. It could be an intellectual framework, but making sure that the work of art really sings in the installation as it's presented, and takes advantage of the spatial quality of a museum, of a gallery space. Think about how it's different to see a reproduction of a work of art in a book versus what you experience in space when it's installed, and how that the whole environment affects what you're seeing. So the quality of the lighting, the kind of space around the work, whatever the interpretive framework. And again, it doesn't have to be only visual. It could also be intellectual in the kinds of questions that you raise, the kinds of information that you offer as a context for the work of art. So I think you're right in suggesting that it's different in every case, because I think it's very responsive in that way. And I think also as contexts change and as audiences change, you can be responsive in that way as well. So it is one of these situations when you sort of know when it works, and you can kind of feel when something is a little more awkward or a little more flat-footed in some way in installation. And so I do think, you know, object by object, exhibition by exhibition, it's a real opportunity to think about how to create the best installation. I tend to like my kind of preferences are for a fair amount of space around art, but I've seen salon style installations that I absolutely adore. So I think it can work in any number of ways.
Thank you. Yeah. Right. I'm actually of the same mindset with just general preference. I always love, it's always so refreshing to me and so exciting when I walk into a giant room and there's just one work of art, either in the center or on the wall. And the energy is just so strong. But yeah, like you said, of course, there's been salon style that have been magnificent as well. So always a balance to try to determine which way to go.
I love looking at one work of art at a time. That's really my favorite, is looking at one work of art at a time and not necessarily shifting back and forth and comparing in the moment. Of course, you think about everything in relation to everything else, objects in relation to other objects, but I really love that opportunity to focus in and look very closely and just take in one thing at a time. And I do think the presentation in space can either facilitate that or make it more difficult to do.
Right, yeah. And it's also a question of the artist's intentions too, which I always think about. Something that always disturbs me is, I know that Rothko wanted each of his paintings to be displayed in a room all by itself. And so to then go into rooms that are like era-based, where it's like the 50s or 60s and you have all of the paintings next to each other and the Rothko's in the corner, it always punches me a little bit. Because so many of these artworks, I demand the respect of having this full room and having, like you said, the opportunity to just look at this art for what it is. And then you can place it in the historical context, and then you can make comparisons and synthesize afterwards. But I think to give the viewer an opportunity to approach it with focus and to let the artist reach out to you alone as one voice before adding the other voices, I think is an experience that is wonderful and should be preserved.
I think it's such an important point. It's respecting the work of art, but it's also respecting the viewer.
Mm-hmm.
And kind of part of our work is enabling those encounters.
Mm-hmm.
And they lead all kinds of different directions because it has everything to do with the person who is looking at the art, right? And that's not necessarily for us to control where that experience leads. But the starting point is something that we can offer up as generously as we can by being as thoughtful as we can about the presentation, both in terms of the physical location and any surrounding interpretation and information that we offer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that goes to my last question, which might be too difficult, but I was wondering so like I was saying, sometimes I walk into a museum and sometimes I'm hit with the feeling of, okay, I'm going to learn something. Other times this is a place for community. Other times it's, okay, here's a historical presentation of these artifacts, so I'm going to learn about the history. Sometimes it's just emotion centered. And I was wondering what you see as the museum's main responsibility, the first responsibility of the museum. As someone going into the museum, what I should be hit with first, perhaps.
First, that is a hard question. First, I want people who come into the museum, I want people to want to come into the museum.
Mhm.
So if it is a first time visit to WICMA, I want people to come in and feel that they're glad they came through the door and have a sense that this is a place they want to be. If it's not the first time visit, I want WICMA to draw people back in. And it's for all of those reasons you described, right? So, because every day is not the same for every person. Sometimes you might be really up for learning a lot of history and wanting to kind of take in quite a lot of new information through an exhibition. Another time you might just want to come in to sit down, look at one work of art, reflect, kind of re-energize yourself before you go back out into the world. And another time you might want to see friends and have some fun conversations and learn about what they've been doing, in the world or in the museum. And all of those things are part of it. I think a lot about how people get attached to museums or other people or collections or really anything. How do we attach? And what is it we can do in museums to have, to offer the greatest invitations in so that people do feel like they can really make the museum their own and want to be there. I mean, it was kind of a general answer, but I think our most important job is to be sure that the museum and WICMA specifically is a place where people want to be. I think if we do that, then everything else will follow.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's lovely. Thank you very much for all these wonderful answers. Leah, do you have anything to add before we sign off?
Yeah, similarly, I just want to thank you so much for your time and your thoughtful answers. And I'm really looking forward to seeing how this whole series of staff interviews turns out. And this has been really exciting, the second interview. So thank you so much.
Yeah, and I'm also very excited to return to WICMA after isolation. I'm
really looking forward to that. It's great to see you both. Thank you for the terrific questions. It's wonderful to talk to you.
Thank you.
So much.